Welcome to Leadership and People. This is a series that pulls back the curtain on leadership by interviewing CEOs, senior executives, and entrepreneurs who have had large exits. We ask these experts about how they built trusted networks to rapidly grow their companies and what advice they wish they knew if they could do it all again. Today on the show, I've got James Clarke.
Again, you understand that, I'm probably at that midlife stage. I won't say it's a crisis, right? But as I think and look back on, our time at Clearlink, that I was just a kid, sort of, just trying to will it. I didn't have any other choices. I didn't have any other options. We had to succeed.
James, thanks for making time.
How you doing, Jess?
So for people that don't know you, can you tell folks a couple of the things that you've accomplished?
Oh, well, first, appreciate you having me on today. It's really kind of you and thoughtful. I'm an entrepreneur turned investor. I started a company right out of school, out of my undergrad, and had three partners that had the exact same skill set that I did. That doesn't always go so well. And timing didn't go so well for me either. I started a business in 2001. Just 6 weeks after 9/11 in the internet space. So .com bubble had burst, the world was falling apart, and it was not an ideal time to raise capital. But it was a good time for me to start a business. I started a company called Clearlink. About 10 years later, we exited that business. But 2 years prior to selling the business, of course, so that was... We sold and closed on selling that business in the beginning of 2011. 2 years prior, we had run a process trying to sell the business also. I had brought in one of our operators to run the business as CEO. But again, the world fell apart in 2008, as you well know. And so he was left running the company. All of our investors the buyers, the pool of buyers dried up, and we ended up not selling the business. Of course, I found myself without a job, and ultimately, had to figure out what I was going to do until that business sold. So I set up an office in New York, and started figuring out what I would do as sort of that next chapter of my life, which was, of course, fell in love with investing and learned a lot while I was out on Wall Street for those couple of years. Flew back and forth every other week. And then as soon as the business closed and we did sell Clearlink, set up shop running Clarke Capital. And ever since, we've been investing in sort of growth equity as our thesis. And our primary focus is businesses that have sort of nailed it, and then we come in with some growth capital and help them scale. And I think we've done okay over the last several years. So I think we've been around almost 8 years now doing that. We last year had 2 IPOs that we participated in and helped to lead. And then we've exited a couple of our other businesses, and we've got a good little track record. And I think we're ready for the next chapter of our business to really get serious about what we're doing. So it's been a great run. We've been very, very fortunate. But we're really happy with the spot where we find ourselves now and look forward to the future.
That's exciting. So the show here, Leadership and People, you've obviously been involved in leadership, growing these different businesses and lead in a different way now where it's portfolio companies, maybe more than your own staff.
Right. Can
you talk a little bit about maybe a leadership lesson that served you well?
That's a great question. There's so many. And I think as I think about leadership lessons, my problem is I think I've learned them, and then I forget them, and I have to relearn them. And it's a painful process, right? So you know this firsthand. But we look at our businesses, and there are always problems. There are great and wonderful things that take place in business, but when we look at the problems that we're trying to solve, and entrepreneurship is not easy, right? If it were, everybody'd be doing it. But as we look at the problems, they're not generally the business problems that we get caught up in. They're the people problems. And so we become, and I talk about this a lot in our organizations that, yes, we can learn this process or we can be the best in class on a certain thing, but if we forget about our people, we've forgotten everything. And so it's being able to really, truly, and it probably sounds trite, probably sounds very simple, but, just remembering the people and the personalities in this. And we can't solve all problems, but it's always the people problems that are the most challenging. And if we can overcome those, then we usually find ourselves in a pretty good spot.
Yeah. Can you give us an example of a sticky one that you've been through?
How much time is your show?
It's only 8 hours. It's only 8 hours.
8 hours. I don't know that there's one that comes to mind right now relative to the challenges that we see. I mean,
or back in Clearlink, or just something of we needed to make a change, and I realized I waited too long, and then
all the time. I think one of the things. Okay, so if you get specific about that, making changes, I think my nature is probably a kinder, gentler nature than a lot of CEOs or entrepreneurs or even investors, and so my tendency is to let's hold off to pass judgment on a certain personality or operator or senior executive in a business. And if I had just followed my instincts, which were generally, we probably need to cut ties or we need to pivot or make a change, we probably would have been much better off doing that. And I keep thinking, okay, the kinder, gentler version of this or the more generous version is going to serve us well. And I think net we're ahead, right? But it's easy to say things like fire fast or, cut dead weight, but it's really hard for me personally as a manager because I happen to care about people a lot. Again, not to be the trite, I'm a people person or anything like that, but I get the personalities. Thinking about people's families and being able to sleep well at night is really important to me. And so we find ourselves probably on the warmer and fuzzier side of, growth equity as an investor or even an operator. So I'm not that cold, calculated killer that some might describe as, a typical either venture capitalist or a private equity investor. So, those kinds of erring to the kinder side is maybe the downside of who I am as a personality, and maybe that's how people have benefited in some ways, but also ways that we've suffered as an organization sometimes in being a little softer than we ought.
So knowing that about yourself, how do you? What kind of self-talk do you have? How do you overcome that about yourself, knowing that you've got it? How do you do better in the future, recognizing that tendency?
I first of all realize that I'm probably not going to change. I've been in, using a term that we hear quite a lot in business, a crucial conversation, right? Where a senior manager within one of our organizations came to me and said, it was one of those conversations where it's, hey, we need more from you. We need you to do better. And that person responded and said, I need you to yell at me. And I thought about that and went silent for a moment and responded and said, I appreciate that, but I'm not going to change who I am just to satisfy your needs. And listen, I look at that and I think about that conversation and probably would have been the right thing, probably would have helped performance relative to that person. They were asking for it. But at the end of all of this, I'm not likely to change sort of, the trajectory of who I am. To help be, the kind of manager that might be a bulldog or a stickler for this or that. And I think I'm more of a guide, a principal guide in what we do. And and a strategist. I think we've got really good ideas that we help execute on, and I'm a cheerleader. So it's hard for me to, be a screaming and yelling coach, if you will. So maybe I wear the skirt of a cheerleader, and we're proud to do that. So.
Too funny. Well, talking about this people thing, coming up with good ideas, finding the right people to do business with. When you think about relationships and networking and spending time with the kind of people that might be the kind of individual you would want to do stuff with in the future, what's some of your approach? What do you do? What do you like to do?
Well, we're betting on horses more than we're betting on races, for sure. And so we first look at these operators and how can we build a meaningful relationship with this individual and back them, essentially, right? So I'll give you the example of probably our most notable, and I wouldn't call it an exit because we're still holders in this one, but they had a phenomenal IPO and the business continues to grow. And it's this great operator out of Idaho. And, he talks about ditch digging. And when he said those words from one Idaho boy to another Idaho boy, it just landed. It resonates with me that, he gets how to work. And so I wouldn't call this operator the most polished. And certainly I think he's far more polished than he was, 7-8 years ago. But I have watched him dig ditch day in, day out, pivot again to a strategy that is, I believe, a world-class strategy. And guess what? The polish has come. He is, in my humble opinion, the best CEO in the make that I've ever seen, because he first knows how to dig ditch and work really hard. I don't know that I'm answering the question specifically relative to sort of what we do and picking people and our strategy, but boy, I watch for those kinds of subtle cues that are, I get out of work, and nobody works harder than this guy. And the polish came, and we backed him, and it has continued to be, a roaring success because of his efforts and a relationship that he's built.
Is there an example of that? Is it necessarily that he's putting in more hours? Is it that he's putting more hours in the right thing? Like, for people who want to get a little more context to that, he's digging ditch. He's going that extra mile. What does that look like?
Well, he's in the office at 5:30 every morning. He is an insane road warrior. I mean, he's everywhere. He doesn't need counsel from me, but he asks for it. So not a text, not an email, never long emails, but he'll pick up the phone and he'll ask for my opinion. And then he's going to do whatever he's going to do because he's got good instincts. And that makes for an exceptional operator. And he's focused. He is focused, and I think that's the single most important thing for an operator to remember. Just focus on what's most important, and the rest sort of follows that way. So it's been marvelous to watch, to see him, because it's not been easy. And his past is not an easy past. He's had some real challenges in business and with other partners and things like that. But it was a big bet for us. But I remember hearing this term, dig ditch, and he does every single day. Extreme focus. So it's pretty great.
Interesting. Well, I want to go maybe a different direction on the same theme. Mm-hmm. You think about the different staff you've had back at the Clearlink days, or whether it's, people involved in the office here, sure, or the other businesses. When you think about identifying opportunities for staff to maybe grow in their leadership, and knowing that finger pointing and telling them to typically is not effective, what's your approach of helping your people become leaders?
Oh, that's a great question. Again, you understand that, I'm probably at that midlife stage. I won't say it's a crisis, right? But as I think and look back on, our time at Clearlink, that I was just a kid, sort of, just trying to will it. I didn't have any other choices. I didn't have any other options. We had to succeed. Just giving you a little bit of context as to how that started. I started in the basement of my fiance, convinced her that I was going to make it a success. She had a well-paying job. I convinced her, and I don't know how I did it, to invest in us so that we wouldn't have to go get other outside investors, and she did, even before we were married. So, that the name even of the company was her maiden name, Earl, and my last name, Clarke, put together, Clearlink, and that's where that came from. And we just willed it because we had to make that work, and I didn't know what I was doing, but I didn't have any other options. We were expecting our first child. I told her by the time we would have our first baby, we would be cash flow positive. And again, remember,
there's a deadline, right?
There was an absolute deadline, and so again, back to that point of pivoting again. We didn't have the model dialed in, and not being a terribly creative person, simply saying, okay, there is something out there, and there's a business that someone is making work. I came from door knocking and selling satellite dishes door to door, had a company with these partners that I described where we all had the same skill set, left that, started Clearlink.
And was that sale number disclosed? what you sold Clearlink
No,
for? Okay.
we didn't share that. It's been sold again to a publicly traded company. I think they've disclosed that number, but I think there are a couple thousand full-time employees there today, and great team. And so many of the initial operators and the talent that we brought in initially are still there. So it's been wonderful to watch, but we were all just kids. I was the senior statesman as sort of the early 30 something, and the rest were, still doing their undergrads, and it's fun to see the talent that's come out of that. But back to this point of having to make it work. I didn't have a choice with Clearlink. We have a choice every day as it relates to what we're doing. I mean, I could have, and we laugh about this, but we could have, bought some silly little island or go buy a house on a beach and sip alcohol-free margaritas for a kid like me and do that. I think that would have been a pitiful outcome for me and wouldn't have been satisfying at all. And so we got really thoughtful about how we were going to build this organization here at Clarke Capital and how we would try to help influence these organizations that we were going to be a part of. Some we've founded, others we've simply invested in, some we've rescued from bankruptcy. But how would we operate? So there are little bits and pieces that we've put together, and I think going back to this, just we know how to work. I grew up working on farms in southeast Idaho, and like my colleague and the CEO of this portfolio company that he had taken public, we know how to dig ditch. We're extremely focused. We're a very light organization. There are only about a dozen of us here in the office, and we definitely fight above our weight class, the kinds of deals that we've done and look forward to doing in the future. But as I think about sort of the core of who we are and what we're trying to instill, with those that come to work here at Clarke Capital and within our organization, is that we are operators first, and investors second. Jess, I know you've spent your time out on Wall Street, and all these investors that close their eyes and write a check and feel like they need to beat you up in a boardroom. But I think part of what we do at Clarke Capital with our portfolio companies is lock arms and then walk forward and even run with these great entrepreneurs. And so I think that we're kindred spirits because we've built companies ourselves. We continue to build companies. I probably have one or two more left in me to go start or found or whatever that might look like, but we really enjoy that part of the business and helping as sort of co-entrepreneurs, but also writing good-sized checks to help these entrepreneurs move forward in their businesses. So I know that's a long-winded answer to your question, but that's a little bit about us and what sort of the thesis looks like for us now and in the future as we build Clarke Capital.
That's great. Well, I know we're kind of winding down a bit here. Maybe as a final question, what's a piece of advice you would want to go back and give an earlier version of yourself?
I'm terrible at giving advice. As one who has received awful advice from very, very smart people, I've gotten, to be fair, I've gotten really great advice as well. But some really smart and very successful people have given me advice that was absolutely incorrect. And had I followed that, I would have gone on a very different trajectory that I'm on right now. So I'm very cautious in giving advice. So perhaps my advice is don't listen to every word that smart or wealthy people give to you.
Let's talk about that for a minute. Guy Kawasaki, the kind of head evangelist for Steve Jobs when the Mac came out, he talks about the bozos, right? He says when you're starting a business or you're running...
You're talking about me? I might be one of those guys.
Well, that's what he says. He says there's two kinds of bozos. There's your brother-in-law bozo, which you spot right off the bat. He says the other kind are dangerous because they wear Breitling watches. He's in a Breitling, right? Okay. They wear a Breitling watch and they drove a fancy car to get here.
Oh, yeah.
And his example was, he said... He got a call, and his answer to the request was, well, I don't want to drive an hour, and besides, I don't see how that can be a business anyways. It was when he was being offered the job of being the CEO of Yahoo.
Oh, come on. Is that right?
On. So he says he figures that cost him $2 billion.
What's a cool $2 billion?
Yeah. He says, the first $1 billion for my family, that's fine. It's the second $1 billion that kills me. But he brings up this point of, and I would be interested in any guidance you have for folks. Obviously, we want to learn from other people's mistakes and wisdom. And at the same time, just because people have accomplished things doesn't mean that their advice is ideal for us. And I'd just be interested in any kind of what your gut check is, or how you make the decision of whether that advice is something you're going to follow or not.
No, I love that example that you brought up of Guy Kawasaki, because you could sincerely sit in your pajamas for the rest of your life in your basement, staring at a television set, thinking about the $2 billion that you missed out on. And I know a lot of guys that happen to do that. It might not be a $2 billion number, but they missed out on a certain deal, or their company didn't go the way that it planned, or they didn't get the promotion. And my counsel is pretty simple, and I think it's universally applicable, is that you just want to keep moving forward and stop, and don't dwell on the missed opportunities. Focus on the opportunities ahead. I've had my own, not $2 billion misses, but my several $100 million misses. Choice that I made, and it was the right choice, but it happened to be probably not the financially as beneficial a choice had I gone the other direction. I've done that over and over, but I don't beat myself up. I just try to make up for it in the next decision. And so dwelling on that past, and again, I'm saying things that you already know, and hopefully your listeners don't find trite, but just focus, a forward focus, a growth mindset. We hear a lot about that today, and we love talking about that with our children, with our entrepreneurs, but that growth mindset of moving forward is really exciting to us. Dwelling on the past is so counterintuitive and not helpful in any way.
It's interesting how we humans need to keep learning that, though. Driving around today, I was listening to a book going through a bunch of the Stoics from 2,500 years ago, and you've got Marcus Aurelius talking about dwell on the present and be consumed with, be present, be consumed with the present.
Fascinating.
Worry about the next thing you're doing right now, and he's got his anecdote about not worrying about the past or the future, but the next step kind of thing.
Yeah.
It's interesting how 2,500 years later, we still need to master that about ourselves, right?
Isn't that the truth? And listen, I'm so glad you're bringing that up. And I have a fellow board member in this publicly traded company that we have, and he asked me on a drive to the airport. He said, and both of his kids are at Ivy League schools today, and he just said, "What's the single most important characteristic you want to teach your children, James?" And I said, "Let me turn the question on you, Mark. Clearly, you're asking me this question for a reason." And he said, "Well, I want them to have confidence." Well, that's interesting, because I know a lot of very, very confident people that happen to be wrong a lot, right? Often wrong, never in doubt. I thought, well, that's great. That sounds like a really interesting thing. And again, he came back to me and asked me the question. I just said, I want them to be driven. I want my children to be driven. I want those with whom I work also to be very driven in what they're doing, because I think, I'm certainly not the smartest guy in the room. I will never say that I am, but I'm a pretty driven individual. I've probably had to kick down the back door of every either Ivy League or overseas institution that I've been to, because I'm driven. Or will a company like Clearlink to happen, or will an IPO to take place, because we happen to be quite driven, and we simply want more and be forward focused in what we do. So I hope that's something that's meaning. It's certainly something that's meaningful to us, and I hope it's something that's meaningful to those that are listening within the context of our conversation.
Yeah, that's great. Well, thanks so much for spending time with us here today.
Thank you. Pleasure's mine.
Hi, my name is Logan Wilkes, and I'm the CEO of Corporate Alliance. A few years ago, I moved to San Diego to build a new market for us there. The biggest deterrent I had to success was I didn't know a soul. I often thought to myself, if I just had a thriving network or influence, this would go 100 times faster. To be honest with you, I had never felt so alone in my life, because A, I didn't have an influence, and B, I didn't know anyone that was going through the same thing that I was. If you have ever felt like this and you are looking to grow your influence, join us at one of our upcoming events. You can check us out at corporatealliance.net and request an invite to one of our upcoming experiences.